Welcome, you curious mind, to a brand new deep dive. Today, we're venturing into a really fascinating intersection.
Mm,
The world where art, architecture, and culture really influence each other within the Islamic tradition.
It's a deep connection.
Yeah, and we're drawing from a pretty rich scholarly book. It unpacks historical views, theories, interpretations.
Mm,
It's a real treasure trove.
definitely. Lots to dig into there.
So our mission on this deep dive, well, to uncover some genuinely surprising insights, maybe challenge a few assumptions you might have about Islamic art and architecture.
And hopefully give you a richer understanding by the end.
Exactly, a richer, more nuanced picture.
And, to kick things off, here's something that might immediately make you think. Our source shares this anecdote
Oh, yeah.
about a Muslim architect in Morocco. He was quite surprised, actually.
About what?
He found out that Moroccan Jews also had this deep appreciation for the same kinds of architectural ornamentation he loved.
Real? The same kinds.
Yeah, he visited some traditional Jewish homes and saw this striking similarity in taste. And what's fascinating, is how this simple observation just challenges a really common belief.
Even among Muslims themselves, right?
Right. That traditional ornament is somehow exclusively Islamic, that it's foreign to other cultures. So this anecdote immediately tells us we're dealing with a much more interwoven story.
Okay, that's a great starting point. It sets the stage perfectly. Let's maybe unpack this a bit more by looking at how we in the West have often approached Islamic art.
Mm-hmm.
Our source highlights Guru Nechapulu's critique, and it's a strong one of this tendency in Western art history.
That sharp dichotomy.
Exactly, that sharp dichotomy between abstract pattern making and mimetic representation.
Which is just art imitating the real world, basically.
Right. And apparently this ingrained way of seeing things, this binary, has really shaped, maybe even limited, how Islamic art has been understood.
Absolutely. Nasipolu argues that this strict separation, the iconographic things you recognize versus the purely decorative, well, it stopped us from appreciating the cultural meaning actually packed into those abstract patterns.
So she's saying there's meaning in the patterns, not just that they look nice.
Precisely. Her solution is what she calls a semiotic framework.
Semiotics.
Yeah.
Like the study of signs and symbols.
You got it. So she's saying, let's look at these abstract patterns as signs, as symbols that carry a whole range of culturally relevant associations.
Okay.
And this approach, her hope is it dissolves that artificial divide. It lets us see the profound meaning that can be invested in what might, at first glance, just look like decoration.
And this isn't just academic theory, is it? I mean,
Right.
the book connects this to the real world.
Yeah.
The Taliban edict in 2001, the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas. That seems like a stark example.
It really is a tragic one. The destruction of the Buddha is based on a very, very rigid interpretation of Islamic views on idols.
Mm.
It just tragically illustrates the dangers. Right?
The dangers of these inflexible understandings.
Exactly. It really underscores the urgent need for more nuanced, more thoughtful discussions about art in Muslim contexts. Discussions that get beyond these simple either-or categories.
And consider how meaning can be expressed visually in all sorts of ways.
Precisely.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly, maybe move beyond just art to architecture itself. The source talks about this post-colonial phenomenon.
Mhm. After independence.
Right, this search for distinct Islamic architectural values. You saw it in new Arab and Islamic states, but also, interestingly, among Muslim immigrant communities in the West.
And the Aga Khan Foundation was quite involved in fostering that debate, too.
So what was driving that quest? Why this focus on finding a unique architectural identity?
Well, if you connect it to the bigger picture of this search, it reflects a really deep-seated understanding. The idea that architecture wasn't just, putting up buildings.
There's more than that.
Much more. It was seen as a formative component of Islamic identity and culture rather than a simple reflection of that culture.
Formative, not just reflective. That's a key distinction.
It is. In that post-colonial era, architecture became this really powerful way to express and even construct identities. I mean, think about it.
Yeah.
As societies were navigating modernity, figuring out their place, the built environment offered a tangible way, something solid, to connect with a perceived past and articulate a distinct cultural presence.
And it wasn't just about, say, building a functional mosque or government building, right?
Hmm.
The book uses this analogy, Ernst Blocher's Baroque armchair. What's that about?
Ah, the Baroque armchair. Yeah, that's a great analogy. Just like a fancy Baroque armchair goes way beyond just being a place to sit.
With all the carving and gold.
Exactly. All the ornamentation, the symbolic weight. Islamic architecture, according to this view, can't be boiled down to just function either, whether that's shelter or worship or even showing off power.
There's always something more going on.
Almost always. An added layer of meaning, of aspiration. The book even talks about a fairy tale dimension you often find.
Like the Alhambra.
The Alhambra is a perfect example. But this imaginative, almost dreamlike quality, it wasn't just a later thing. You can trace it back to early Umayyad and Abbasid monuments too.
So if it's not just about function, how did people back then, in the early Islamic period, actually understand the meaning in their buildings?
Right.
The source brings up Al-Jaya and his concept of al-Bayan. That sounds pretty important.
Oh, Al-Bayan is huge. Al-Jaya was this incredibly influential intellectual, and he saw Al-Bayan, which means things like signification, communication, expression, manifestation, the whole package.
Wow, okay.
He saw it as absolutely central to life itself, crucial for society, for memory, for passing on knowledge.
And how does architecture fit in?
Well, crucially for us, he didn't limit Al-Bayan to just language. He explicitly put architecture right up there as a core medium of Al-Bayan.
Alongside speech and poetry.
Exactly, as a powerful way to convey meaning.
That's quite a statement, architecture as communication, just as potent as words. Did he expand on that? Did he think all expression was equally eloquent?
Not exactly. He did categorize living beings as participating in Al-Bayan, but he made a distinction between the eloquent and the speechless, or maybe ununderstandable.
Humans being eloquent, presumably.
Right, with our capacity for language. But even beyond that, Al-Jaa explored how bodies themselves, through signs and behaviors driven by Garaz's instincts, desires, how they also manifest Al-Bayan. He even connected things like, sexual desire and the pleasure of food to creating institutions and, fascinatingly, to aesthetic qualities.
Wait, desire shaping aesthetics. How does that connect to architecture? That feels unexpected.
It is, isn't it? But he argued that desires, especially the desire to connect with others, to please them, have this big socializing function, and they influence what humans create, including architecture.
So the desire to impress someone could lead to more ornamentation on a building.
That's the idea. The desire to impress or create beauty could drive embellishment, perfection in design. The seemingly unnecessary becomes necessary in a way to fulfill this deep human need for connection, for aesthetic pleasure. And Al-Jaa had this nuanced view too, seeing humor and seriousness as linked, and suggesting this paradoxical need for the unnecessary in art and writing. That definitely resonates with architectural ornament.
He also compared architecture to the art of the book and the effects of voice and decoration. Why those comparisons?
Right. This is really insightful. He was trying to get at the underlying frameworks of knowledge, the ways of understanding things in his time, what the source calls the epistemic constructs.
The mindset of the era.
Kind of, yeah. By drawing these parallels, he wasn't saying a building is a book, literally, but maybe that they operate within similar systems of making meaning.
And affect people in similar ways.
Exactly. Think about how a great text or a stunning building can evoke feelings, convey information, leave a real impression. The challenge for us, the book says, is to reconstruct those ways of thinking that made these comparisons meaningful then, not just slap our modern ideas onto them.
Okay, that makes sense. So from Al-Jaa's big theory of Al-Bayan, the source moves to Al-Khalil ibn Ahmad. He worked on Arabic language and poetics.
Yes, foundational work. Kitab al-Ain, Kitab al-Urud, really mapping out the structure of Arabic.
So what's the link between his language theories and early Islamic architecture?
Well, the argument the book makes, connecting the dots, is that there are these fundamental structural connections. A shared approach, maybe, to form and order.
Between poetry rules and building design.
Kind of, yeah. Between the formal rules of Arabic poetry that Al-Khalil laid out so meticulously and the design principles in early Islamic architecture, especially its geometricism and also a certain deliberate ambiguity.
How so?
Well, think about it. Al-Khalil rigorously analyzed Arabic. He set down precise rules for sounds, phonology, and the patterns of verse, prosody. He had his famous metric circles classifying rhythms.
Okay.
And the parallel being drawn is that early Islamic architecture also seems to have the systematic, almost rule-based approach in its design, even in its abstract decoration.
I see, like a shared grammar almost.
In a way, the book draws this really compelling comparison between the structure of the Qaida, the traditional Arabic ode, and how early Islamic architecture programs the experience of the person moving through it, spatially.
So like the poem unfolds over time. The building unfolds over space.
Exactly. Both have this kind of unfolding structure. The Quetta often starts with a prologue, then a nasib, that section about love and longing,
Right.
before getting to the main subject or journey, the raffle. And similarly, early mosques, for instance, guide you through this carefully designed sequence of spaces. They create a specific flow and experience.
The book also mentions that in Arabic poetics, at least for Al-Khalil, form was kind of primary over meaning. How might that relate to the architecture?
That's a key point. Al-Khalil's approach really emphasized the inherent musicality, the formal structure of the language itself, meaning often arose from, or was even seen as secondary to, the craft of the form.
And you see that in the architecture, too.
Well, it resonates with that ambiguity we mentioned in early Islamic architectural forms and decoration. The focus wasn't always on explicit symbolism, like this shape means X.
It was more about the effect.
Yes, more about the power of the abstract forms themselves, their intricate interplay, creating a certain aesthetic, a certain feeling, an experiential effect. It's less about what a pattern represents explicitly and more about the visual impact, the feeling it creates. Kind of like how the rhythm and sound of a poem hit you before you even analyze the words fully.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
What about this other poetic concept, al-Tashmin? Borrowing and reworking old themes. Does architecture do something similar?
The book suggests a really interesting potential link there. Al-Tachin is all about selective adoption, creatively reworking existing poetic bits.
Taking something old, making it new.
Exactly. And you could maybe see a parallel in how architectural motifs and styles evolved. Certain elements get adopted from earlier traditions, pre-Islamic, Byzantine, Sasanian, whatever, and then they're adapted, reinterpreted within an Islamic context. The book even floats the idea that this might have been a way to assert a distinct cultural identity, maybe reacting to movements like the Ash'ubiyya.
What was it?
That was a movement where various non-Arab groups within the early Islamic world were asserting their own cultural importance.
Yeah.
So selectively borrowing and integrating visual styles could be part of that whole cultural conversation. It's a fascinating possibility.
Directionality is another big thing.
Yeah.
Obviously crucial in mosques. The Qibla pointing to Mecca. Does that connect back to the Quetta at all?
Well, the book points out some interesting parallels, yeah. Just like the Quetta often moves towards a specific goal or person it's addressing, the mosque's orientation towards Mecca is fundamental. Can't get more directional than that.
Sure.
And even how minarets evolved, eventually getting aligned with the mihrab, the niche showing the Qibla that reinforces this strong sense of direction.
Yeah.
And interestingly, the book contrasts the early Abbasid architecture, which often lacked a really defined exterior facade.
It wasn't focused on the outside view.
Less so, it seems. Compared to later Fatimid architecture, which had much more pronounced facades, it suggests shifts in how the building addressed people looking at it from the outside. A bit like how a poem might reveal its message as it goes along.
Now, the source also brings up something that feels a bit like a contradiction. This inherent ambivalence towards architecture in Islamic thought, even in the Quran.
It does feel paradoxical, doesn't it, given the incredible buildings we associate with the Islamic world.
Exactly.
But yeah, the Quran apparently presents architecture in this dual way. On one hand, it's a blessing, a sign of prosperity, like descriptions of the advanced civilization of the Ed people.
But on the other hand,
it can be shown as a symbol of arrogance, worldly excess, maybe even a distraction from piety, from spiritual things. And this ambivalence gets clearer when you look at legends like the story of Sinamar or the myth of the city of Iram.
Okay, tell us about those. What do they reveal about how people felt about architects or about really grand buildings?
Well, the legend of Sinamar, he was the architect of this amazing palace, Al-Kawarnak. It exists in a few versions.
Oh, different endings.
Kind of. In one famous version, the king who commissioned it has him killed out of jealousy.
Jealousy? Why?
So he can't ever build anything as beautiful for anyone else.
Wow, that's dark.
Isn't it? But in another version, Sinamar gets killed because he made some boastful, maybe insulting remark about a supposed flaw only he knew about.
So different reasons, but the architect still meets a sticky end.
Right. And these different versions, they suggest this complex, maybe uneasy attitude towards architects and their amazing, ambitious creations. It's awe, but maybe also suspicion, even fear of their power or vanity.
And the other myth.
Iram. The myth of Shaddad and the legendary city of Iram also appears in different lights. Sometimes it's praised, sometimes it's criticized. Again, it seems to reflect this underlying societal ambivalence about grand architecture. Is it a sign of God's favor and human skill, or is it just earthly pride doomed to fade?
That really adds complexity. Moving to the political side, it's pretty obvious buildings can be about power, right? Commemoration, dominance.
Absolutely. The book even mentions rulers deliberately destroying enemy buildings. That's a clear political act.
But it also introduces this concept of the gaze. What's the significance of the gaze here?
The gaze here is about how buildings are intentionally designed to be seen, how they're staged for an audience.
Like a performance.
In a way, yeah. Just like people are conscious of how they look, rulers and patrons used architecture to project an image, to deliberately capture the gazes of others.
To send messages.
Exactly. Messages about authority, wealth, culture. There's a great anecdote about Caliph al-Mutawakkil asking a poet what he thought of his brand new palace.
What did the poet say?
Well, that's the interesting part. One poet focused on the sheer beauty, the grandeur, but another poet gave a more ethical critique, focusing on the extravagance.
So different readings of the same building?
Precisely. It shows how architecture could be interpreted differently by those looking at it. And the book even connects this to legal discussions by al-Shafi about vision during prayer and medical treatises about the eye by people like Thunin ibn Ishaq. It shows how deeply important seeing and being seen were culturally.
And what about the architect themselves? Their role seems a bit fuzzy in early Islamic societies, according to the source. Not quite like our modern idea.
Yeah, it seems our modern idea of a distinct, specialized architect might not map perfectly onto that time. The evidence is a bit limited, but the terms used, muhandis and bana.
Engineer and mason builder?
Roughly, yeah. But they don't seem to cover the same broad scope we think of today. The muhandis initially seems more focused on practical stuff, like water channels, infrastructure.
More engineering in our sense.
Perhaps. While the bana was more the skilled craftsman, the hands-on builder, and interestingly, the book suggests the actual design, the concept, could sometimes be developed somewhat separately from the technical building know-how.
Huh. So the designer wasn't necessarily the builder.
Not always. Or maybe the roles overlap differently than we assume. It's still a bit unclear.
Okay, finally, the source brings up something we touched on earlier, desire. But specifically, the interplay of desires in creating architecture.
Right. The designer's desire, the patron's desire, even the desires of the people who will eventually see and use the building.
How do all those desires interact?
Well, this brings us back to that poetic and fairy tale nature of architecture. There's this story about Ziyad and his masons.
Yeah.
Ziyad sees the finished building, and he recognizes his own unexpressed feelings, his aspirations, reflected in its form.
Wow. So the building captured something he hadn't even articulated.
Exactly. And it raises these really deep questions for you, the listener, to think about. Can a building really be seen as this shared object, embodying all these different desires?
How does the architect translate the patron's wishes? Maybe wishes the patron doesn't even fully realize they have.
And how does the architect's own creative desire inevitably shape the result? The book suggests maybe people see their own unspoken feelings reflected in a building.
And that's part of what gives it meaning, what makes it resonate.
That seems to be the idea. That recognition plays a big role in its impact.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive.
Yeah.
Wow, we've covered a lot. We started by challenging those Western art historical binaries.
Looking beyond just representation versus abstraction.
Right, and seeing the meaning packed into abstract forms. Then architecture as this vital tool for identity, way beyond just function.
And Al-Jawz's amazing idea of al-Bayan, architecture as communication, linked to language, even desire.
Then those fascinating links between poetry structure, like the qada, and architectural design principles.
That shared grammar, almost. And the ambivalence, too. That tension within the tradition itself about grand buildings.
Yeah, the stories of Sinamar and Iram. Plus the politics, the power, the importance of the gaze.
How buildings are staged to be seen.
And finally, that complex interplay of desires, patron, architect, viewer, all coming together in the built form.
So our hope really is that this dive has given you, our listener, some genuinely surprising facts, maybe shifted some perspectives.
And offered a much more nuanced, interconnected view of this incredibly rich subject.
Definitely.
So here's a final thought, something for you to maybe mull over. How might these historical perspectives we've discussed, perspectives from within the Islamic tradition itself, perspectives that challenge some of our usual Western boxes and reveal these deep, sometimes surprising connections between art, poetry, architecture, desire,
Mhm.
How might they challenge your own contemporary ideas?
Yeah, about art, about identity, about the buildings around us right now.
Exactly. It's something to think about. We definitely encourage you to reflect on these ideas, maybe even dig into the sources more if you're curious. There's so much more there.